Lieutenant Edgerly, a member of the 7th Cavalry serving in Bentine's battalion, which linked up with Reno's force about 15 or 20 minutes following Reno's withdrawal, provided the following description. Around 10 o'clock on the morning of June 25, 1876, we were approximately 15 miles away from the enemy camp. Our entire force was assembled at that point. We paused while Custer, accompanied by Crow and Ree scouts, ascended a hill to observe the Indian camp, which was visible. When General Custer descended from the hill, officers' call was sounded. The officers gathered around him and he informed us that our presence had been detected. His scouts had pursued a small group of Indians they had spotted, but the Indians managed to escape and headed towards the Indian camp. Since there was no point in attempting a surprise attack, as he had initially planned for the next morning, we would instead swiftly advance and, if possible, engage them in the village. The notion was that the Indians wouldn't withstand an entire cavalry regiment, and upon learning of our approach, they would likely attempt to flee. He then directed troop commanders to mount their troops and report readiness to move out. Within a minute, every troop commander had reported in. General Custer and his adjutant, Colonel Cook, Lieutenant W.W. Cook, then organized the regiment into 4 battalions, each consisting of 3 troops. They assigned command of each battalion to one of the 4 senior officers, Reno, Bentine, Keogh, and Yates. Major Reno was instructed to advance directly down the valley towards the Indian village and initiate an attack, with support provided. Colonel Bentine was ordered to veer left at an angle of approximately 45 degrees from Reno's path and engage any Indians encountered. The expectation was that the Indians would flee either to the right or left. Captain McDougal, with his troop, was designated as rear guard to oversee the pack train. The specific orders given to Colonel Keogh and Captain Yates were unknown, but General Custer accompanied them along with 5 companies, totaling approximately 250 to 300 men, moving in a direction parallel to Reno's. The last time I saw General Custer alive, he was heading off in the mentioned direction. Colonel Bentine obeyed the orders and soon encountered a series of high hills. He dispatched an officer, Lieutenant Gibson, to the summits of several hills to scout for any visible signs of Indians along their route. Lieutenant Gibson repeatedly reported back that there were no indications of Indians in sight. Subsequently, Colonel Bentine veered to the right, and after about 5 or 6 miles, we intersected Reno's trail, which we promptly followed. After tracing it for several miles, an orderly trumpeter dispatched from General Custer arrived and handed Colonel Bentine a note stating, "We've come across a large village. Hasten your pace, bring up the packs." We continued onward, and when we were about 3 miles from the Indian village, we observed signs of conflict in the valley. Soon after, we witnessed a group of men, over 100 in number, rushing towards the bluffs on the east side of the Little Bighorn River. This river flowed on the west side of the Indian village. The men crossed the stream and vanished into the bluffs. At that moment, we were situated on the right bank, east of the stream, and at a considerable distance from it. Since the orderly who delivered the message from Custer had informed us that the Indian village had been taken by surprise and that Reno was driving the Indians ahead while attacking them relentlessly, I assumed that the men we observed fleeing were Indians being pursued by our men. We hastened towards the ford where Reno had crossed, intending to rush to his aid. However, as we neared the ford, a Crow scout named Half Yellowface emerged on our right and signaled for us to join him on the hill. Without delay, we veered to the right and ascended the hill. Upon reaching the summit, we discovered Colonel Reno and his battalion, along with several wounded men desperately in need of water. To our surprise, we learned that they had been forced to retreat from their position. There were a few Indians lurking behind rocks and hillsides, firing shots at us. A skirmish line was quickly formed, and these Indians were dispersed within minutes. Soon I heard intense gunfire coming from the direction where we later discovered the remnants of Custer's unit. I could also see clouds of dust and horsemen darting back and forth on the opposite side of the river, approximately 4 miles distant. During this gunfire, Colonel Weir, my captain, approached me and inquired about our course of action. I responded that I believed it imperative for us to rush to Custer's aid without delay. He agreed with my suggestion, and I overheard the first sergeant expressing the same sentiment. He then inquired whether I would be willing to accompany him with just D Troop if he managed to obtain permission. I affirmed my willingness. Subsequently, he approached Colonel Reno and Benteen, and upon returning shortly afterward, he mounted his horse, accompanied by an orderly, and headed towards the direction from which the gunfire had originated, which had by then largely subsided. I assumed that he had received authorization to proceed with the troop, although he later informed me that he hadn't and hadn't even requested it. So I mounted the troop and followed him. After proceeding for a few hundred yards, I veered to the right with the troop and entered a small valley, likely the same one traversed by Custer and his men, or a path nearly parallel to it. We headed directly towards the large group of Indians, whom we had already observed from a higher vantage point. While we were moving down the valley, Colonel Weir, who had been on the hill to our left, noticed a large group of Indians moving in our direction. He gestured for me to redirect the troop towards his position, which I promptly did. Upon reaching the bluff, I spotted Colonel Benteen, Captain French, and Lieutenant Godfrey approaching with their respective troops. We continued along the bluff for a brief distance when the Indians began firing at us. The troops dismounted, formed a line on the ridge's summit, and returned fire. The gunfire persisted for about 30 minutes until General Reno ordered the troops to retreat to their initial position. During our return, one of our men was killed, and we lost only one horse, despite a couple of Indians firing upon us as we left. Upon rejoining Reno's position, we found the other troops arranged along the crest of the hill. Weir's troop and Godfrey's troop aligned side by side to extend the established line formed by our troops. Shortly after we assumed this position, the Indians advanced towards us and commenced firing. Although the gunfire was intense, only a few men were killed as most of the shots passed over our heads. The exchange continued for over an hour and persisted until 30 minutes past dusk, marking the conclusion of the day's battle. The following morning, just before dawn, intense gunfire erupted again from the hills, about 500 to 800 yards away from us. This continued until around 10 o'clock. After that, the firing subsided significantly, although we could still spot small groups of Indians on the ridges surrounding us. In the afternoon, the Indians on the opposite side of the river dismantled their lodges or teepees, and around 4 o'clock, they all departed. Since we had taken our position the previous afternoon, we suffered minimal casualties. We remained in that location or moved to a nearby position overnight, and the next morning, Lieutenant Bradley, from General Terry's column, who was in charge of the scouts, arrived and informed us that Custer and his entire force had been killed. Shortly afterward, General Terry arrived with his column. He then dispatched our regiment to bury the deceased. Along with enlisted guys from L Troop, Lieutenants Calhoun and Crittenden were the first dead troops we came upon. Their men's bodies formed a disciplined skirmish line, and the bodies of these officers lay right behind their troops, where they belonged. Crittenden's body bore numerous arrow wounds. Moving on, we came across Colonel Keogh and his troop. They appeared to have been retreating towards the knoll where Colonel Custer's body was found, engaging in combat as they withdrew. The other men I observed showed no indication of being in a regular formation. Their bodies were scattered across the ground, generally heading towards the knoll where Custer lay. We found the bodies of General Custer, Colonel Cook, Lieutenant W. W. Cook, Colonel Tom Custer, his adjutant, a number of enlisted men, and a number of horses on the aforementioned knoll. We discovered Lieutenant Riley, Captain Yates, several enlisted soldiers, and horses around the bottom of the knoll. Boston Custer, General Custer's sibling, and Reed, his nephew, were situated roughly 100 yards away from the general's remains. The only officers' bodies I observed that had been disfigured were those of Colonel Tom Custer and Colonel Cook, Lieutenant W. W. Cook. All the bodies had been stripped of their uniforms. The majority of the men were completely unclothed, although in several instances they still had their undershirts, socks, and drawers on. The dead lay below the main village on the east bank of the river, about 4 miles from where Reno had taken up position. When I ventured out with the troop in the afternoon of the 25th, I witnessed numerous Indians riding back and forth across the battlefield, where we later discovered the bodies. They were firing at objects on the ground, although we couldn't discern what those objects were. When I initially reached the crest of the hill where Reno was stationed on the 25th, I could hear the intense gunfire, which lasted for approximately 15 or 20 minutes. Subsequently, the gunfire ceased. After laying General Custer and his men to rest on the eastern side of the river, we crossed to the western side and interred the fallen soldiers from Reno's command, numbering about 40. During our search, we came across 2 Indian lodges, each containing 6 bodies in one and 5 in the other. These individuals were impeccably dressed and secured to a pole at the center of each teepee. Chief Low Dog later explained that this was an honorable method of handling those who had died courageously in battle, leaving their bodies for the enemy to claim. I've never encountered a similar practice elsewhere. In my view, the Indians likely departed hastily due to the impending arrival of Terry's column, which likely startled them. Near the teepees where we discovered the deceased Indians, there were as many dead ponies as there were Indians. Facing the teepee, the horses were positioned in a circle around it. Based on my observations, I estimate there were approximately 7,000 warriors present. I made this assessment by comparing it to the size of Terry's command, which consisted of about 500 men, a formation I was familiar with, as they rode down to the area where I had spotted the Indians the day before. Terry's force appeared to be significantly outnumbered by the Indians. According to the accounts provided by the Indians, Custer's trail indicates that he traveled along the river, which was only about 15 or 20 yards wide at that point, on the east side or the right bank. In contrast, Reno had crossed the river and launched his attack from the west. The riverbank was steep and elevated, making it difficult to descend from the bluff until reaching a location slightly over 3 miles from where Reno established his position after retreating across the river. At that spot, Custer discovered a ford, and it was widely believed that he attempted to cross but was met with resistance and forced back to where his lifeless body was discovered. Along the route from the ford to where Custer's remains were found, dead bodies were scattered. Before embarking on the march, Custer, who typically wore his hair long, had it cut short. Although his body was unclothed, it showed no signs of mutilation.